Hi everyone, welcome to our discussion on what the effects of COVID-19 on unemployment entail. We will be hearing from Andile Zulu, a UKZN graduate who wrote an article for the Daily Maverick regarding the government's implementation of the unemployment grant. We will then hear from Antoinette and Mokgesang Ramaisa of the EBSK Stellenbosch University to hear what this all means for students. Stay tuned to hear what they all had to say.
With the declaration of a national lockdown by the South African government, our economy entered into a kind of paralysis. With millions of people forced to stay at home and away from work, there were very serious concerns about the ability of citizens to survive through the lockdown. Out of fear and anxiety, many people raised concerns about their ability to pay rent and whether mass evictions would become a reality after the lockdown. There were other concerns about whether South Africans would not slide into more serious forms of debt, unable to cope with their various living expenses in the absence of a stable income. And there were concerns from the business sector about whether they would be able to employ people after the lockdown, considering that they were likely to face substantial losses in profits due to a lack of economic activity and them having to close their doors. So, in response to this uncertainty and instability, the South African government introduced a series of welfare schemes and relief funds and social welfare policies as a way to firstly soften the blow of economic devastation that was likely to result from an economy that was closed for an indefinite amount of time. And then secondly, as a way to offer South Africans some semblance of security and some financial stability through this moment. So one of the methods, one of the forms of welfare that was introduced was a 350 Rand unemployment grant to be given on the condition that a citizen is over 18 and that they receive no other form of government assistance or welfare, and that of course that they are unemployed. So unemployment has been one of the most persistent and biggest challenges to economic growth and economic development in South Africa. It's been a challenge to economic development in terms of lifting it being a barrier to lifting South Africans out of poverty and decreasing inequality. And there's also been a challenge to economic growth in terms of being an obstacle to productivity and the stimulation of our economy. Now, what has been interesting to see is the reactions to this 350 Rand unemployment grant. On the one hand, you've had South Africans who are quite optimistic and quite positive and even congratulatory of governments for introducing the fund, recognizing that people need some way to survive through this crisis. On the other hand, I've seen reactions and criticisms that to me capture how deeply divided South African society is along lines of class. In other words, how people who are wealthy and those of us who are middle class, how our imaginations have been stunted by our privilege. And by this, I mean how people are not able to empathize with those who are unemployed and with those who are poor because their conditions of living are totally alien to us. We may see unemployment, we may see homelessness, but because we aren't familiar with it, we are able to make certain assumptions, we are able to propagate certain myths about the unemployed and the poor. And these myths, we've heard them all before from various people and platforms and politicians. One of the clearest articulations of these myths came from Sello Diga in the Daily Maverick, who wrote an article about 2 weeks ago that proposed that the unemployed work for the 350 Rand grant by being involved in community service on a weekly basis. In other words, he proposed that people work for welfare. So besides my moral outrage at this idea, I was compelled to write a response piece which sort of functioned to dispel a lot of the misconceptions we have about unemployment. And these misconceptions are such as the idea that the unemployed are in their situation because of laziness. The unemployed lack the ingenuity the creativity and the imagination to start businesses, to become entrepreneurs, and to find holes in the market, that the unemployed somehow enjoy their dependency on governments, that those who have children should not be receiving grants, that the unemployed are leeches and parasites on the very limited resources in the country, that they are a burden on the tax base. We've heard all of these things before, and these concerns mask themselves as pragmatic, but really they're just a reflection of limited imaginations and constricted empathy. Because people have to recognize that, number one, unemployment is a systemic issue, right? This is to say that the possibilities and resources that are available to people and the choices that are available to people are often heavily influenced, restricted, and maybe even opened up by the material conditions in which they find themselves in. If you find yourself working class or poor in South Africa, it means that you likely were subjected to a poor level of education. It means that you were likely unable to access tertiary education, and that in the instance where you were able to access a university education, once you graduated, you were submerged in debt. This means that often those who are working class and poor are equipped with what people normally refer to as low-level skills, which means that they are unable to enter the labor market because our economy has been undergoing extensive changes over the past 30 years, and it now requires a lot of specialized labor. This means that there is a mismatch in the labor market between a lot of people who have low-level skills and an economy that requires specialized labor. When an individual is in that situation, they aren't able to control that condition. And so unemployment is not so much a result of people not exercising their agency, people having a low work ethic. Unemployment is a result of systems like our education system malfunctioning. Other factors which contribute to unemployment that are beyond the control of individuals is, for example, the reality of automation. So automation is a reality that is on the horizon for South Africa, in the sense that there are forms of low skilled labor that can be done by machines, that can be done by technology, and therefore employers are likely to let go of their employees because automation radically decreases the costs of production for businesses and for industries. So we are likely to see a lot of retrenchments in the near future. We've already begun to see them in the banking sector. Another factor that contributes to unemployment is the fact that businesses are still reeling from the 2008 global financial recession and still don't have the capital to be able to hire as many people as they would wish, particularly your small and local businesses. So now that we've recognized that unemployment is systemic, it's important then to create policies which deal with the conditions that create unemployment. So there have to be policies from government and from civil society that say, how do we make education of a good quality more accessible to South Africans? How do we make university more accessible to the majority of South Africans who have been locked out of it? But those are long-term goals and long-term objectives. In the interim, it is important to see relief measures such as the 350 unemployment grant as not only a way to provide security and stability for people who are living in unemployment, which is exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's also important to see social welfare as an investment in the citizenry. Empirical evidence shows that the idea that people are dependent on government if they receive social welfare and that they don't work is a myth, right? Targeted schemes of social welfare often result in people acquiring new and specialized labor. They often result in an increase of household or personal income, and they often result in an increase of productivity. If people have a net of security underneath them, they are better able to function at work. Their time is freed up, and then they are better able to pursue or try to pursue achieving certain skills. So it's important to see social welfare as an investment in citizenry. And the less people unemployed, the more stability and the more economic productivity and the more economic development we are likely to see. But then closing off, a few reflections on the future of unemployment, especially for the youth. I don't think it's an understatement to say that unemployment may be the biggest threat to social and political stability in South Africa. Often we don't discuss the costs of unemployment in our politics, in our and in our socio-economic lives. In terms of the political outcomes of unemployment, if citizens don't see or are unable to access opportunities, if citizens are caught in a struggle for survival, this increases anxiety, this increases anger, especially in societies that are unequal, where a few amount of citizens are able to increasingly get wealthy and are able to access resources and opportunities, while the mass of citizens are locked out of that prosperity. This creates resentment, it creates bitterness, it creates rage and anxiety among citizens. And those feelings which ferment and which grow amongst the population can be manipulated and exploited by populists and politicians concerned about amassing power. We've seen this in America with the election of Trump. We see this in countries such as India with the growth of Hindu nationalism. So the populism is likely to be a reality for South Africa in the future if unemployment is not dealt with. Politicians can manipulate the anxieties of citizens by offering them rhetoric that offers short-term solutions that merely inflames people's anger as a way for politicians to get more power. On the other hand, the social consequences of unemployment are likely to continue. So in the absence of opportunity and resources, in the absence of jobs and stable incomes, people are more likely to turn towards alternative and illegitimate and dangerous means of survival, such as crime. So there's a misconception that we have about criminality. We often see it as a failure of people's moral choices, when in fact, criminality is a result of inequality and poverty, in the sense that when there are no conventional means to prosper and to succeed and to have stability, people will find illegitimate means to do so. And then, of course, for the youth, I think we're likely to see the mental health issues faced by young South Africans be exacerbated by unemployment. I call this the spiritual costs of unemployment, because unemployment means an individual is caught in the struggle for survival, which results in a great level of anxiety, which can result in a person's in a person's self-esteem debilitating, as they perceive themselves as not worth it, as not being a valuable contributor towards society. This can also increase in depression. And when people are faced with these mental issues, we see a hike in suicide. We see an increase in people indulging in drug abuse, whether it be of narcotics, whether it be of hard drugs, whether it be of alcohol. So overall, unemployment is a huge threat towards the stability of South Africa, and the COVID-19 pandemic, by freezing the economy, is likely to exacerbate that issue. What the future holds is unknown, but for now, we should very much welcome schemes of relief and social welfare as to give people some form of comfort and stability to get through this very uncertain time.
A big thank you to Andile for his valuable insight and discussion around unemployment during COVID-19, as well as addressing important discussion topics around the unemployed. Next, we will be hearing from the chairperson and vice chairperson of the EBSK.
Today we have the members of the EBSK, which is the Economics Management Student Committee of Stellenbosch University. Please, can you guys just introduce yourselves to all of our listeners?
Hi, I'm Antoinette. I'm the chairperson of the EBSK. I'm currently a fourth year BFLB student.
Hi, I'm Mokgesang Ramaisa, vice chairperson of the EBSK, and I'm honors mathematical statistics student.
So we're really going to be speaking about the effect of COVID-19 on unemployment and how it affects us as students, and the fact that you guys mentioned that you're graduates. We're going to speak about that later in the discussion, but I feel like we are speaking directly to you who are going to be entering the workforce quite soon. So the whole COVID-19 and with unemployment, firstly already being a big issue in South Africa, and now with retrenchment and everything happening, I feel like this has put you guys in a very nervous position. But to just start, we're going to be speaking about the grant that the government is going to start rolling out from, I think, the end of May. So firstly, what are your views on the grant? Do you think it's going to be helpful in firstly alleviating the wave of unemployment that is going to happen throughout South Africa during this time? We can start with Antoinette.
Well, I think in terms of the grant, it's a difficult question to answer because on the one hand, of course, it's better than nothing. It is something that can help assist alleviate the sort of issues that are going to be present in our country going forward. But at the same time, if we look at the scale of unemployment that's there already, you do sort of need to question to what extent is this truly going to make a difference. But I think generally, I think that obviously the whole world is going through a lot of changes at the moment. And just to sort of remain as positive as I can about that, I think that with change, there is opportunities. There are things that are going to be, there are opportunities for South African citizens going forward. It might look a little bit different than what we might have imagined our careers to look like. If I can focus on students specifically, I definitely think things might look a little bit different. But that is not to say that there aren't opportunities going forward, and especially if you look at the faculties that we're involved in personally. I'm in the EMS faculty and in the law faculty. There's so many new regulations that need to be complied with, and that creates an opportunity for people to advise. That creates so many different opportunities and I mean this is across any kind of career path. There are new opportunities being created with all this new regulation, even though it might look a little bit different than it did before. So yeah, but I mean, of course, this is an issue that was already in our country. This isn't a new issue. I hope that with everything going on, maybe this actually sheds more light on it, and more funding and more time and energy and resources actually going into addressing unemployment in our country.
I think with your mentioning of how nothing is going to be the same, I think the president in one of his speeches regarding COVID-19, when he was addressing the nation, he said that we have to be prepared for the fact that when we leave this pandemic and go out back into the normal world, nothing is going to be the same due to the wave of reparations and the wave of just everything, how the economy is going to be structurally suited to affect, to basically help us to recover from the pandemic, because there is going to be a lot of recovery that is necessary. But Mokgesang, is there anything that you would like to add from what Antoinette had said?
I think it's a good initial start, the COVID-19 fund. But like for the only way to generate employment is to generate entrepreneurship. That is something that the government is focusing on in terms of business homeless rescue and stuff like that. But I think it's a good initial grant in terms of while businesses are trying to find their feet again. It's also going to be hard for new businesses to start up this time. And so really, if there's no business, then there's no employment. So it's kind of a dual thing. You'd want to also just restructure entrepreneurship, but have that fund there and the grant in the meantime, just to alleviate that lag or time lag that it's going to get for businesses to start up again.
In our first speaker that we have, Andile, he speaks about an article written by another member of the Daily Mail, and he says, and he basically critiques it because this member says that he doesn't agree with the grant, and he feels that there should be something that the unemployed are doing in order to receive this grant. And he says it in the form of basically community service. So they participate in something to do with the economy or something to do with the state. And then in turn, the government basically gives them the grant. So do you think, in Andile's critique, he says that this idea proposed by the member of the Daily Mail promotes an idea of the unemployed becoming slaves of the state. So what do you think about this? Do you think it should be a sense whereby there's something that the unemployed are doing in order to receive a sort of income? Or do you agree that it would be promoting this idea of the unemployed becoming slaves of the state? We can start with Mokgesang.
So this, I also came across this article, and it was like very interesting to me because it, for me personally, this is just my personal opinion. The imbalances in the country had already existed before COVID-19.
Yeah.
And I can't necessarily hold these people to fault. It's not their fault that they're necessarily unemployed or don't have the skills to find employment. So it's really, for me, just they need basic human rights. They need food, they need water, they need shelter. So, I mean, this is everything everyone needs. And yes, if they can find employment during that time while having the, yes, but to the extent of like, let's earn this, let's do community service. I mean, if there are streets that need to be cleaned or something to that effect, then you'd normally pay someone to do that. So that is called employment. I wouldn't say you'd have to work for a grant. To me, that just doesn't make sense. If I'm providing a service or doing something, I would expect to be paid unless it's voluntary work. And I don't think a grant necessarily fits that definition. A grant is there to help alleviate the person while searching for work. And so that would be my personal take on
it. I understand. And Antoinette, can you just add on that, please, or give your opinion?
Yeah, I for the most part, I actually agree with what you said. And, you know, I think you sort of touched on something, and that is like one of the misconceptions, I think, regarding unemployment is that, you know, this idea of people just aren't trying, which is, I think, one of the big misconceptions when it comes to unemployment in our country. It really is, well, there's so many different complex factors that go into it, but one of them is just simply a lack of opportunities. And I think to sort of expect someone who is in that situation to do something like community service. Also, the other thing that I wanted to mention here is that this is, after all, human rights that we're talking about. It seems very strange to me that I don't think I fully understand the argument of having to sort of work for that. I think that's, or to do something in order to receive that. I think we're speaking about something very basic that I don't necessarily agree that someone should have to work for, even if it is community service. And while I absolutely see the merit of people doing community service, I don't necessarily think that it should be people who are already in such a vulnerable position themselves expected to do that, especially not to sort of earn something that really is there to help them in a very, very basic capacity. Because, I mean, we're not speaking about something that's going to, you know, we are speaking about something that's really going to help them in a very, basically achieve their very basic rights.
Also, just touching on what both of them said, the word grant in itself is something that is granted, and it's not something you work for. It's something that's given to you unconditionally, if I could say that. So just thought I'd mention that.
Because the minute we start saying that people have to actually work to receive this income, it's taking away the actual concept of a grant, because it's not something that people should be working for. It's the government giving them this because of the situation, more so because of COVID-19. And speaking about the grant, do you think us as students, should we be receiving this grant? Antoinette?
This actually isn't something I've really thought of a lot, and I want to sort of say it really depends on the circumstances of that particular person. It depends on their circumstances, their socioeconomic circumstances. I think it's very difficult to sort of put a blanket statement across students.
Yeah.
Especially if we're going to look at university graduates or university students. I mean, you can't categorize them all in one sort of population group when it comes to sort of the issues surrounding unemployment. I really think that it depends on the particular circumstances of the various students.
Mokgesang?
I would agree with Antoinette. It's a very circumstantial thing because we're not also as students actively looking for work, or we most of us are full-time students in undergrad, at least, talking to university space, right? So and you have NAFSAs, and there's a lot of things that come into play. So I don't necessarily think the focus should be on full-time students. Maybe part-time students, I think there might be an argument there, but as full-time students, I don't think there's really a necessity. But again, there could be cases that I'm not thinking of, for full-time students as well. So that is another thing. I would think that if you don't fall in the category, NAFSAs would be covering you at the moment. So yeah.
But let's just say for a full-time student as well, there's also a big kind of financial strain on things like accommodation and food and textbooks and like resources. So do you think in that way full-time students would, like, circumstantially, of course, according to like their circumstances, would you think that there needs to be some sort of grant that is maybe a little bit more than what the unemployed are granted, just because there's so many things that is out of their control?
I would hope that NAFSAs would cover this, because I think that is NAFSA's mandate, right? That's where I'm basing this argument on. And maybe NAFSAs then should make scope to cover a bit more students, a wider gap, since COVID-19 is probably going to create a wider gap. I think that's an option that I think the government should entertain, is maybe expanding NAFSAs a bit because of COVID-19, rather than taking the COVID grants and applying it to us, if that would make sense. Because I think NAFSAs was instituted for students.
I think the issue comes where with NSFAS is that there's so many discrepancies within NSFAS, and so many students who don't even end up receiving the NSFAS grant. So I feel like some people, this will be people's opportunity to finally get that financial strain, in a sense, alleviated. But then again, it's something that I do think the government should be looking at with NSFAS period. They should be looking at expanding, because there's so many people who aren't covered by it. But with that being said, with this new grant being instated by the government, do you think this opens up a new idea for an unemployment grant being officially put in place? Like now the COVID situation is over, does this COVID grant, well, obviously it won't be COVID grant anymore, but do you think a grant for the unemployed should be carried on? Antoinette, please.
I definitely think that, I think across the board, something that's a lot of people have realized during this pandemic is, wow, you know, we could have actually funded this whole time. You know, I mean, of course, it's a strain on the economy if you're going to look at it from an economic perspective. But I think once we sort of get things up and running again, eventually in the future, you know, when, yeah, I think, okay, maybe I can address it this way. Of course, our economy is sort of taking a knock at the moment, but that's an issue that's happening globally. And I think after the pandemic, you know, we are going to see growth again. And, you know, proportionally, we perhaps didn't take that much of a knock. And I definitely think that something that's been realized during this time is that, wow, we could have actually been funding all these various causes, and that includes unemployment. You know, maybe we could have been doing this the whole time. So I definitely think it does open that idea going forward of, well, why haven't we been doing this the whole time? Why haven't we been providing a grant for people who are unemployed? Why haven't we been providing all of these different resources that are now being provided from so many different areas? So I definitely would say that it, at least in my mind, does open an opportunity for that going forward, and having sort of the infrastructure in place for this type of grant. Yeah.
Mokgesang.
I think for me, the importance of that grant would be that job seeking is expensive if it actually comes down to it. You need money to actually go look for a job. So to me, that actually makes sense to sort of help people along while they actively seeking jobs. And maybe the counter argument would come into inactive job seekers. So like, how would we differentiate from that? I don't necessarily think that is our place to do that. But I think those who are actively job seeking, an unemployment fund would do a whole lot of good. They could print CVs, they could post things in the mail, transport to get to interviews. It could change the game significantly in terms of those expenses. Plus feeding yourself, actually making sure that you've got enough rest, you look good going to the interview, so that you could actually get the job, you know. And once you're employed, right, then bam, you know, you're good to go. We don't need to fund you anymore. I think it is a good idea. Job seeking does come with costs, so yeah.
I think especially since our country does have such a high level of unemployment, it's something that the government should be looking at, since I know it was due to the COVID situation that they instated it, but it's something that in the long run that they should be looking at starting out. But now, if we look at specifically for students, so how do you think graduates will be impacted by the increased rate of unemployment? As I said earlier, that especially since I'm presuming you're now doing your postgrad. What do you think the COVID situation means for you, as you are very soon going to be entering into the workforce? What do you think it means for you, Antoinette?
Well, as I actually said previously, I think that for students specifically, a time of change actually does create new opportunities. And I think for students in a lot of different fields, I think that their career path might look a little bit different going forward as what they expected, because the whole world, the whole workforce is going through changes. But it's when if we speak about, you know, students specifically and university graduates, I think it's a very interesting situation where, to some extent, in terms of employment, this is the way the world was moving. We were moving towards sort of an online environment in any event, but it's now been accelerated a lot. I think, especially if I can speak about students who are now sort of third year, fourth year postgraduate, I think they actually have a very, very unique set of skills at the moment, because, you know, we've learned the sort of interpersonal skills that come with student leadership and just being in a campus space, but now also learning the additional skills that comes with online learning and things like that. And I think it's really important that students don't undersell that. I think that's something very valuable that's going to be needed in the workforce going forward. And yes, of course, this has in fact affected the amount of opportunities. But also, if we really get the infrastructure in place to have, distance employment and have all these things in place, I mean, there's no reason why you can't be employed by a company that is based in another country or in another city. I think it creates opportunities in that sense for university graduates, which I think is, I think it's very important for students to realize that, maybe what they had envisioned originally there might not be as many opportunities in terms of that, but there are new opportunities for graduates specifically being created at a very accelerated pace because of this.
Mokgesang.
Yeah, Antoinette brings up a very interesting point, actually, like one that I hadn't thought of. For me, a lot of my friends are graduates and they're out there in the workspace. And, my one friend said to me, I would not like to graduate this year. And that hit hard, like, because it's sort of the anxiety that's like, are there even gonna be jobs? As much as there will be new opportunities, the opportunities we knew are gonna probably shrink. And I imagine I would have not thought about it as Antoinette did. I would have just been like, all the opportunities that were there are gone. So like, what now? What do we do? Instead of thinking of like, oh, they might be like this whole digital space that's opened up, right? Companies are shrinking. We don't know. I think for me, the biggest uncertainty now as a student in terms of graduate programs and internships is we don't know whether they're shrinking. We don't know what's going on in that space. I can't necessarily say that there will be as much opportunity as there was. Sort of the more pessimistic side in terms of the old opportunities, traditional opportunities. I think they will shrink a bit. And even though I've seen like a number of graduate programs are still running and stuff, it's sort of, for me, the incentive to keep those graduates that I'm a bit worried about. It's the incentive to have so much workers. I mean, I was just thinking of a small example, right? During the pandemic, you don't need as much workforce. Like, for example, McDonald's can't have the normal full workforce at McDonald's because of social distancing, the amount of people that can be there. And I'm just thinking, if companies see that, oh, like we have half the amount of workforce, things are still working, like why did we have so much workforce in the first place? And that's something that worries me. Like I'm worried about that train of thought. And I'm worried for what that means for graduates next year. I know I might opt to stay in academia if my bursary is like, oh, we don't necessarily have the capacity to take you on for a year of work. And that might be the escape that many others choose, just like more studying until such time as the economy recovers, if feasible.
Do you also think, like, as someone who has a tertiary education, has gone through like their whole schooling experience, do you think that maybe, I think that as an educated person, you might have much more opportunity even during COVID and after COVID. Do you think that also maybe as someone who is educated and there becomes jobs as kind of like alleviation schemes for COVID, do you think that also like creates more opportunities for you, or do you think that that's a bit of a long shot?
I think there is counterbalances in my field. I think at the moment there's really a lot more scope than there was. There's just data running everywhere at the moment. So I mean, you need people to handle data. So particularly for my field, I'm not worried. But definitely I think there is scope for alleviation jobs and sort of sort of ways to counteract COVID. I think it, like Antoinette said, it will create new opportunities. It's something that I hadn't certainly thought about. And I think it's an interesting idea to entertain, that it's not all doom and gloom.
I definitely think that, students that have a tertiary education are absolutely at an advantage. Like
Definitely.
it's if I can go back to your example in terms of McDonald's and different companies realizing that they might not need as big of a workforce, I don't think that's going to affect um, university students to that extent. Because like I said, there are sort of new opportunities being created. I definitely think that can also happen in a space for like alleviating issues. I think definitely if I can look at the legal field, there's so many places that now sort of need to be advised on how do we comply with all these different things, how do we make sure that our workforce has what they need, but unfortunately, or maybe fortunately for us, these are opportunities that require a level of training or education. I think a lot of the new opportunities that are being created are to do with technology, are to do with research. Also, it does require, a level of training or education. So I don't think it's going to impact students with a tertiary education as much as it impacts the workforce at large.
With what Antoinette has said just about how new jobs are going to emerge, that's an idea that I completely slipped my mind. I think I was more on the side of Mokgesang, whereby I've just been in the gloom with, okay, now all these companies are realizing that they don't need humans and technology is going to take over. And basically, we're doomed. But the second question kind of relates to that in the sense that do you think we are equipped in terms of education to deal with the problems that will arise after COVID-19? And as Antoinette said earlier, you said with us being students and knowing how to being given the opportunity to navigate the online system, we are now being equipped to move on into the next era whereby we now have this experience to navigate the system. And for the problems that arise after COVID-19, I feel like some of them will be technologically driven. So we will have that sense of advantage. But do you think that our education system is equipped to deal with the problems that will arise after the COVID-19 pandemic ends? Antoinette?
I think yes and no. I think navigating the online learning space is definitely equipping us with important skills going forward, and just the way the world is moving in general. And like I said, I think we are definitely in a very unique position where we're in this sort of transitional phase, and as challenging as that is, I think that kind of equips us with a very unique set of skills where, first of all, we had to go through this big change that none of us really expected or planned. And then also we have learned the sort of more traditional kind of interpersonal skills from, being in the more traditional university environment. So we have, I think, a very unique combination of skills that maybe the older generation and the younger generation won't have. I don't think we're quite there yet in terms of fully equipping students for the skills that they will need going forward. I think a big thing for me is just the uncertainty. I mean, we don't know exactly what problems we are going to face going forward. Yeah, things are changing so rapidly, so I think it's very difficult to ensure that students are properly equipped. I definitely think we are perhaps better equipped than what we were previously to online learning. But I think it's important for students to also sort of really make sure that things to do with technology is something that they are learning about and equipping themselves with those skills, because it is going to be very important going forward.
I don't think that the education system is necessarily ready. My hot take is universities only consist of 1% of the population, right?
Yeah.
If I'm being 100% honest, I don't know how TVET colleges and other colleges are coping right now with teaching and learning. It is quite worrisome. And I think that's where my concern stems from. I mean, if you just look at, I'm going to take matric for example, the amount of people who all of a sudden, when schools tried to like send worksheets via WhatsApp, like the differences in my alma mater school, high school, which is just like, okay, we're gonna do this via Google, we're gonna do Google Classrooms or whatever, Hangouts. This is where we're gonna have class. No disturbance whatsoever. And then you get a school in Soweto or Deep Kloof or wherever, and they can't do that. It's not the same. It's really imbalanced. And I think to say our education system can cope would be to say that the imbalances in the country have been corrected, and they have not been corrected. And that's just something we really have to acknowledge when having this kind of conversation in terms of, is the education sector ready? I don't think so. It's not ready unless there is some way of making the playing fields balanced for everyone, which they're not.
I think you raised a very.
Oh,
sorry.
Yes. No, you can carry on.
Sorry, I just wanted to say, like, it kind of brings it back to a point that was made earlier. Is a lot of these issues, they're not new. There was massive imbalances before. I think
Yes.
this is just really shining a light on how severe those imbalances are. I really do hope that going forward, the pandemic brings more attention to it, and actually more resources and more time is put into addressing those imbalances. But I think, yeah, across the board, that's definitely something that this pandemic has shone a light on, is just how massive this discrepancy is. Because it's sort of
Yes.
true. Some schools are and universities are coping very well. It was sort of a seamless transition, whereas other institutions are really, really struggling at the moment. But I don't think it's an entirely new issue. I think it's just really made very blatant at the moment.
Yeah, I genuinely think, as you said, that these issues have always been there. Inequality in South Africa has always been there, and the situation has exacerbated to the extent of how large the gap is between your privileged schooling systems and your underprivileged schools. So I do think a lot has to happen now, since we've opened the wound and we have seen the extent to how bad the situation is. A lot has to happen in order for us to perhaps even be ready for the fourth industrial revolution that is coming, because now that a lot of things have moved online and onto being technology driven, the entire world is moving into this new era. And in order for South Africa to be equipped to participate in this new era, we have to ensure that our education system is well advanced. Um, but just with ending, what do you feel students need to hear regarding the economy, jobs, and unemployment during COVID-19?
I think for me, the philosophy is there will always be bad times. It might have not been COVID. It might have been a different endemic. It might have been a different problem. But, keep your head up. And if you're drowning, keep trying to swim in the drowning. That's all I can say, is one day at a time, one step at a time. I think you can never defeat that philosophy of um, falling 7 times and standing up 8. I just think there'll always be difficulties, no matter who you are. I think some difficulties are more difficult, but like, just kap aan, as they say,
I absolutely agree. I think for everyone, to some extent, this is a very challenging time, but I really would encourage students to remain hopeful. And I think there are a lot of new opportunities that are going to come with this time. Something I would really advise students is to be open-minded and be maybe a little bit more flexible. Be open to the idea that maybe things going forward are not going to look the way that we planned for most. But that doesn't mean that things are going to be terrible going forward. There might be really exciting new things that you didn't even think were possible. And I think it's so important for all of us to really keep head above water, first of all, but also I think for students to equip themselves, learn as much as you can in this time, use it. Um, Even if the skill that you're learning is simply just how to adapt to these big changes, I mean, that is still a really important skill to have. And I think to see it that way, we're learning so much. And although it is challenging, it is something that's going to equip us going forward. Yeah, and just remain hopeful. I think that's really important too.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I understand that academically it's a bit shaky. So your time here is really, really, really appreciated. And I've learned so much, and I've been open up to so much, and just my way of viewing everything that is happening. And like Antoinette has really instilled hope in my gloom and doom that I've just been having. But we really appreciate you joining us and just sharing your ideas and opinions on this topic.